Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. In the village of Nether Durnham, where ivy grew up every brick cottage and flowers sagged softly under the weight of their own bloom, the most exciting thing was usually the vicar's sermon running 5 minutes late. Life unfolded to the calm rhythm of teacups, curtain twitching, and the subtle ballet of gossip exchanged across garden gates. That Tuesday morning started out the same way. The sun shone through scattered clouds, children dozed on their way to school, and Mrs. Penelope Hargreaves had already finished her third pot of Earl Grey. However, something was off. It was already 10 a.m., and the mail still hadn't arrived. In Nether Durnham, the post was always delivered by 10. Mr. Thomas Larkin, the village postman for nearly 14 years, took pride in his punctuality, which was so consistent that several of the elderly inhabitants set their clocks based on the squeak of his bicycle wheels. Mrs. Hargreaves had barely started complaining about the unusual delay when she observed something even more disturbing. Thomas Larkin's bicycle remained abandoned beside the war memorial, its front wheel leaning into the hedge like a drunken bow. The postbag was hung over the handlebars, full and unopened. The village appeared to hold its breath. Within an hour, 3 different neighbors confirmed that Thomas had not been seen that morning. The baker's boy didn't hear him whistle. Old Mr. Cattermole, who only received invoices, remarked with concern that he hadn't received one in 2 days. By lunchtime, Constable Sims had been summoned from the neighboring parish, his countenance red and confused. He cordoned off the bicycle as if it were a crime scene, though no one knew exactly what the offense was. A search party was organized. Miss Marple, crocheting in the corner of her niece's drawing room, only looked up once to say, "Oh dear, that's not like him at all." They found him about mid-afternoon, or rather, they discovered what remained of him. Thomas Larkin's body was discovered floating face down in the reeds of the pond behind St. Ethelburga's chapel. The constable stated it must have been an accident. The poor fellow slipped in, possibly due to a stroke. He appeared to be under stress. There were mutterings about indebtedness and a disagreement with a brother at work. But Miss Marple, who had known Thomas since he was a boy and delivered letters with an awkward blush and a cowlick he couldn't control, simply said, "Nonsense." She muttered it softly, only to herself, as she turned away from the police line and went slowly away. Her pale, inquisitive eyes travelled over the scene once more. Miss Marple thought it was remarkable that no mail had been delivered that day, especially for a postman. The village of Nether Durnham did not respond well to disturbance. For decades it had kept its peace like a secret, defending it with polite intensity through flower exhibits, parish council meetings, and a mutual dislike for novelty. But now a postman had died, the post sack had not been touched, and no one could recall the last time something truly terrible had occurred. By evening, the news had spread through every lane, hedge, and alley. Mrs. Hargreaves had chatted with Mrs. Denby, who had informed Mrs. Fenton, who had spoken to her lodger, who had rushed down to the grocer's, where Reverend McInnes overheard her purchasing ginger biscuits. "He'd dropped the biscuits. It's a terrible tragedy," he continued sadly, repeating the phrase so many times in an hour that it seemed rehearsed. "The Lord works in surprising ways." Mrs. Price, the widow who managed the dry goods shop and was not a fan of nebulous theology, mumbled, "I don't think the Lord had much to do with it." By the time nightfall crept over the hamlet rooftops and church bells chimed the hour in mild confusion, hypotheses had sprouted like ivy. Some were wildly creative, such as a passing stranger, a vagabond with a knife, foreign operatives, and even young Peter Ellison, who had read far too many spy novels. Others remained more grounded. Thomas had slipped, poor soul. Perhaps he'd finally succumbed to the anxiousness he'd been expressing recently. Many agreed that Thomas Larkin had not been himself in recent weeks. He had been seen lingering outside the vicarage gate one morning, not knocking but simply standing as if unsure of his purpose. Another time, he was overheard muttering in the Rose and Crown about someone watching his rounds. He knocked over a milk bottle, apologized, and left before finishing his pint. Still, no one could explain why the post sack remained untouched. The bag was full, just as it would be when he got it from the sorting office. However, not a single letter had been delivered. Does that not strike anyone as peculiar? Miss Marple inquired gently over tea at Mrs. Banbury's, where numerous neighbours had met to share their anxiety, and over-baked scones. "Oh, I imagine he must have felt poorly, dear," Mrs. Banbury said quickly, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "I felt faint and intended to sit down, but instead fell into the pond." Miss Marple regarded her hostess with gentle, almost maternal patience. "But if you felt faint, wouldn't you sit on the bench near the chapel or lean against the gate?" Thomas Larkin had been delivering letters in the village since 1939. He was intimately familiar with the route. He knew where to go if he needed to rest. The room became quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mrs. Prow, who rarely spoke unless prompted by strong emotions, cleared her throat. "He had no reason to be at the pond. That path does not pass by the pond, you see. It cuts through the green, past the postbox and down to the butcher's. He wouldn't go behind the chapel unless he was following someone." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, or meeting someone." That single suggestion was enough to ignite the room. Mrs. Denby clutched her pearls and offered a list of possible liaison. Mr. Harcourt. The retired schoolmaster mumbled something about moral decay and was ignored. Miss Marple, for her part, simply sipped her tea and listened. What intrigued her more than the speculation was the behavior it concealed. Some in the room were genuinely distraught. Others seemed excited, enlivened by the sudden stir of mystery. But one or two were notably tense. Mrs. Agnes Whittle, who prided herself on knowing the precise number of eggs every villager bought each week, had spoken very little and kept glancing at the clock. Young Geoffrey Banbury, home from university for the summer, had lingered in the hall rather than join the gathering, and once dropped his teacup when someone mentioned the word police. It was a particular phrase, however, that caused Miss Marple to pause in her musings. It came from Mrs. Prow again, almost offhandedly. "I suppose the letters will be delayed a day or two, though. I expect it won't matter much. No one gets anything interesting anymore." Miss Marple set down her cup. "No one gets anything interesting anymore." It was not true, of course. In a village like Nether Durnham, letters were often the most interesting things of all. There were still sisters who wrote longhand from Cornwall, adult children who sent checks for rent, discreet bills, charity requests, birthday cards, and every now and then, though no one ever admitted it, letters with no return address, tucked carefully away before spouses could glance at them. If Thomas had failed to deliver even one of those letters, someone might be anxious indeed. The next morning the police returned in full presence, now joined by a plain-clothed inspector from the county. Inspector Malalary, lean, pale, and quietly annoyed, stood at the edge of the pond and scowled. "It's clean," he muttered. "No sign of a struggle. Medical examiner says no trauma, no head wound, no blood, lungs full of water. He drowned." "But he couldn't have fallen," Constable Sims said uncertainly. "There's no slope." "Exactly," said Mallory. "So what the hell was he doing here?" Miss Marple, who had quietly wandered by with her basket of wool, gave the inspector a small smile and murmured, "One does sometimes walk where they're summoned, even if the path is unusual." Mallory glanced at her, barely suppressing impatience. "Yes, thank you, madam." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly and kept walking. But she had seen something else. A scrap of paper at the edge of the path, torn, water-stained, half buried in mud. No one else noticed. She waited until the men had turned their backs, then stooped to tie her shoelace and tucked the piece into her basket. Back in her sitting room, she held it to the light. It was no longer legible in full, but two things could be made out. "Never meant for you to see this," and below in slightly neater handwriting, 8:30 behind chapel. So Thomas had been meeting someone. He had come expecting a message, perhaps even this very letter, and had ended up drowned. Miss Marple sat back and folded her hands in her lap. The murderer, she thought, was someone who knew what Thomas might have seen, someone who had something to lose if a letter was read. She looked out the window toward the chapel spire, just visible beyond the hedgerows, and whispered, "There is never a crime so plain it needn't be read between the lines." And in Nether Durnham, where secrets lingered longer than footprints, she suspected the letter that had never been delivered might matter more than anyone yet realized. Miss Marple sat near her window the morning after the soggy fragment was discovered, watching the sky change from ash to light blue. Her knitting needles rested in her lap, the half-finished shawl forgotten. The ripped message sat on the tiny table beside her, accompanied by a porcelain sugar dish. She had carefully dried it overnight, but the paper was frail, with ink smudged along the edges. Still, the time and location remained: 8:30 behind the chapel. Not a phrase to take lightly. Miss Marple was never fond of melodrama. She did not chase shadows or seek thrills, but she had learned from a lifetime of quiet observation that people rarely lied for no reason, and even less frequently told the whole truth when they had something to protect. Thomas Larkin had planned to meet someone that night. He had left on time like he always did, and now he had died. That morning, as the village stretched its limbs and yawned into the day, Miss Marple went for her daily stroll to the churchyard, her cane clicking softly along the stone path. The pond beside St. Ethelbera's glistened in the early morning light, an unpretentious, innocent little mirror rimmed by reeds and soft moss. Nothing on its placid surface revealed what had happened only 2 days before. She moved carefully around the perimeter, pausing sometimes to check the ground. The police had searched the area, but they weren't searching for subtlety. Footprints on dry grass, broken bracken, or areas where a person may have stood and waited. A patch of flattened weeds along the low chapel wall drew her attention. Not big enough for a struggle, but definitely where someone had squatted or stood for a while. From there one could see the trail heading in from the green, which Thomas would have followed. She knelt gently, her fingers brushing over a slim object partially buried in the grass. A button. It was simple black, as is common on waistcoats and cardigans. There is no crest or mark to indicate its provenance, only a delicate cream-colored thread remaining trapped in its back. Miss Marple pocketed it silently. As she climbed to her feet, the chapel bell rang softly behind her. Not for a service, but because the sacristan had started cleaning for Sunday. Oliver Trent, a slender young man with shirt sleeves and scuffed shoes, had only been appointed last year. He nodded to Miss Marple and offered her a tired grin. "Isn't it eerie back here these days?" She answered the smile with her own. "The pond is motionless as usual, yet still waters can conceal more than they reflect, don't they?" He blinked at her and shrugged. "Suppose so. I never liked walking home past it after dusk. You were here late the night Mr. Larkin disappeared, right?" She asked kindly, not accusing, but simply inquiring. "I believe they are tidying the vestry." Oliver nodded again, this time more cautiously. "Yes, Reverend McInnes made me sort through old hymnals. I left shortly before 9. I didn't see anything unusual, though. Just fog. Did you see Mr. Larkin?" "No, Mum, not that I can recall." She thanked him, and he ducked back into the chapel as if relieved to be away from the morning's inquiries. That same afternoon, the inquest was formally postponed. Inspector Mallory had seized control of the local station and called numerous people for questioning. The majority were ready to help, or at least speculate, but a handful were not. Agnes Whittle, for example, absolutely refused to say whether Thomas Larkin had ever mentioned her name. When challenged, she became upset and insisted that she had nothing to do with love letters or dead men in ponds. Miss Marple thought it was strange that no one had mentioned the term love letter before her. Later at the Rose and Crown, the discussion moved like smoke around the tables. Mr. Harcourt mumbled darkly about town nonsense and metropolitan intrusion, while Geoffrey Bambury held a whisky with shaky hands. The post sack, still sealed yet hefty, had been dispatched to the central office for cataloguing. Inspector Mallory had intimated that they would soon find out if anything had been removed from it. But Miss Marple questioned it. No, she thought. If anything had been taken, it had not come from the sack. It had been added, or rather replaced. She made a quick detour at the dry goods store on her way home, purchasing 2 jars of jam and a tin of ginger biscuits that she didn't need. It was a convenient pretext to chat with Mrs. Price. "Isn't this terrible?" the shopkeeper responded, cautiously wrapping the tin. "The entire business makes you wonder if you truly understand the people around you." "Indeed," Miss Marple mumbled. "I assume Mr. Larkin was delivering something that wasn't wanted." Mrs. Price tensed for a heartbeat before offering an overly bright grin. "Well, you could say that about the majority of the post. Not everyone likes surprises." "No," Miss Marple answered, "but it's rare that surprises end in pawns." She paused to tweak the hem of her sleeve. "I do hope you didn't lose anything important in the post that morning." Mrs. Price blinked. "What makes you think I was expecting anything?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple replied carelessly. "Have you always ordered your spices from Norwich by letter?" And they normally arrive on a Tuesday. The elderly woman's lips stiffened. I identified other vendors. Of course, Miss Marple replied with a kind smile. As she turned to leave, she heard a faint sigh from behind her. Miss Marple had started organizing her notes by the evening. Not literal ones. That wasn't her style. But she organized her thoughts with the same systematic care she did with embroidery, loop by loop, creating a pattern of conduct. Someone in the community had enticed Thomas to the chapel, someone who had either sent or intercepted a letter, someone fearful enough to face him, but desperate enough to silence him when that confrontation failed. And she was certain that the letter had not been sent at random because of its age and pattern recognition. It had been a highly personal issue, not one of war, crime, or politics, but of shame, inheritance, or affection. These were the underlying motivations in peaceful villages. Miss Marple started the fire and watched the glow slowly climb the logs. She understood the cadence now, the tempo of the unheard and the weight of stillness. It wouldn't be long until another secret emerged, or another individual vanished. The next morning, clouds lingered low above Nithodom, casting a gloomy pall over the cottages and tiny pathways. Rain had rained lightly throughout the night, not enough to wet the ground, but enough to make the flagstones slippery and the hedges gleam with droplets like silver pins. Miss Marple stood at her kitchen window, absent-mindedly stirring her tea, her attention fixed on the distant chapel spire, which peered through the mist like a watching eye. She was waiting for something, not necessarily news, but activity. Small indicators in the individuals around her, such as flinches and glances, frequently revealed more than words. It was never the confession that solved the riddle, but rather the contradiction, the moment when someone, in an attempt to conceal the truth, exposed far more than intended. By 10 o'clock, she had covered herself in her rain shawl and headed off toward the high street, strolling past the post office, now temporarily shuttered and locked under heavy shades. A single notice on the door stated, "All postal operations will resume shortly. We appreciate your patience." A new face had appeared in the village, a substitute postman drafted from East Bramley. He was younger, taller than Thomas, and visibly uncomfortable with the attention he received. Miss Marple offered him a polite nod as he cycled past, to which he responded with a mix of confusion and anxiety. Everyone in Nether Durnham had stared at him that way for the past 3 days, as if he were a ghost, dressed in the uniform of the man who should have arrived instead. At the corner grocer's, the conversation had not died. Mrs. Penelope Hargreaves was immersed in conversation with Reverend McInnes, their voices low yet earnest. "I assure you," she said, "it was not an accident. I knew something like this was going to happen eventually. Maybe not with Thomas, but with someone." The vicar spoke quietly, adjusting his wire spectacles. "This is not the time for hysterics." "Hysteria," she whispered. "You were not the one who observed Agnes Whittle shred up the note in the bin behind her business." She was nervous and pallid as skimmed milk. "Are you sure that was a note number?" "But I'm sure she was watching the chapel path." Miss Marple chose a little bag of barley sugar from the shelf and cleared her throat briefly to signify her presence. Both parties became instantly quiet. Reverend McInnes gave her a nod. "Miss Marple," he replied in the tone of someone who has previously practiced his own innocence. "I trust you're doing well." "That's plenty," she said, "though I must say that I find it disconcerting when individuals start tearing up papers in private." Mrs. Hargreaves reddened and occupied herself with the tins. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, and Miss Marple made her way to the library, a tiny institution that was sparsely filled even on normal days. Elena Broom, the librarian, sat behind the counter, her hair fixed, cardigan buttoned to the throat, and spectacles low on her nose as usual. She scarcely looked up when Miss Marple walked in, but her palm paused briefly on the date stamp. "You haven't seen Mr. Banbury today, have you?" Miss Marple inquired, selecting a gardening book and gently placed it on the desk. Helena looked up swiftly. "No," she answered too hastily. "Not since Tuesday." "Why?" "There's no reason. Only I'd heard he occasionally helps with your shelving." "You're short-staffed since the junior assistant left, aren't you?" Elena hesitated. "Yes, though Geoffrey is hardly the most reliable volunteer." Miss Marple grinned. "No, I dare say he isn't." She took her book and left with no additional comment, but something about the librarian's statement didn't sit well with her. Elena had not denied seeing Geoffrey. She had simply responded as if the question itself were dangerous, implying that someone else had seen him, and she was unsure how much Miss Marple already knew. Geoffrey Banbury was not a bad youngster. He simply had too much imagination and too few limitations. Miss Marple had encountered this sort before, intelligent enough to feel superior, irresponsible enough to believe the laws only applied to others, and he had been drinking the night Thomas died. That much the innkeeper verified. Miss Marple was more concerned about something other than Geoffrey's activities. It was his fear. Not guilt, not yet, but fear of being discovered. That evening, Miss Marple drafted a small note and asked young Daniel Rower to deliver it. The boy, always ready for a work that felt important, hurried off toward the Banbury home, folded envelope in hand. Its contents were straightforward. "Would you mind popping by for tea tomorrow around 4 p.m.? I have too many biscuits and too many inquiries." J.M. Geoffrey arrived the next day at exactly 4 p.m. His hair was slicked back too nicely, and his shoes were newly polished. All of these indications indicate that someone is overcompensating. Miss Marple, dressed in her oldest cardigan and smiling warmly, welcomed him with the ease of a devoted great-aunt. "I hope you don't mind fruitcake," she added, as they sat in the sunroom. "Though I usually feel that people reveal more than sponges, do you agree?" Geoffrey blinked. Sorry, she poured some tea. "Well, I have never believed admissions made over coffee. Way too bitter. However, when it comes to sponge cake, people tend to relax. Something about how familiar it is." He released a shaky chuckle. "Do you believe I have something to confess?" "Oh no," she replied hastily. "But you do know something, right?" His smile wavered. "I don't understand what you mean." Miss Marple leant forward slightly. "Geoffrey, you were at the Rose and Crown on the night that Mr. Larkin died. Several others saw you leave soon before 8. That would give you plenty of time to get to the chapel. I didn't and wasn't." She did not interrupt. She waited. He swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the window and back again. He murmured, "I went to meet someone, not Thomas." "A girl, Elena." Miss Marple gave a small blink of astonishment. "Miss Broom, she warned me not to tell anyone." She was afraid. People were expected to speak. Said her father would cut her off if he found out she was fine and was seeing someone beneath her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And have you met her?" Geoffrey hesitated. I waited near the chapel for half an hour. She never arrived. I developed a cold and went home. That is all." Miss Marple's voice was soothing yet authoritative. "Have you seen Mr. Larkin?" "No, have you heard anything?" "Just a splash." That was sufficient. Miss Marple returned to her small writing desk after Geoffrey had left, flustered, ashamed, and slightly relieved. A pattern was starting to form. Elena had lied. Geoffrey had been duped into going there, and someone other than Geoffrey or Elena had utilized the meeting place as cover. Thomas had received a bogus letter, authored by someone else. She removed the button from its envelope and placed it beside the dried fragment of the letter. The thread matched the cream wool of a cardigan she'd only seen once, worn by a person standing stiffly behind a shop counter, eyes furrowed, voice reserved. She stared at the lamplight and muttered, "Agnes Whittle, what did you see that day?" The village held its breath. Something was unwinding, and Miss Marple was drawing it to her needles, thread by thread. By the next morning, the mood of Netherham had changed to that of linen stretched on an embroidery hoop. The rain had resumed in a steady drizzle, blurring the outlines of the settlement with green and grey. The puddles on the cobblestoned road shimmered like melted glass, and the hedgerows appeared to lean in, listening. Miss Marple sat in the parlour, her hands loosely folded around a letter she had written but hadn't yet sealed. It was written to Inspector Mallory, and while brief had numerous pointed inquiries. She had considered mailing it, but she knew Mallory, like most men in uniform, wanted theories supported by concrete facts, or at the very least an illusion of rationality wrapped in civility. She had observations, contradictions, and a button. Instead of sending the letter, she tucked it away in her recipe book, made herself another cup of tea, and turned her focus to Agnes Whittle. Miss Marple understood the importance of stillness, and Agnes had become markedly silent since the day of discovery. It wasn't only anguish and terror. It was the stiff, rigid silence of someone urgently attempting to maintain a border, as if one stray remark may ruin everything. Miss Marple tightened her shawl and walked out for the village. Not to Agnes's shop, but to the Rose and Crown, where rumours fermented faster than cider. When she walked in, it was 10 o'clock, and only 2 people were huddled over their tables. Mr. Cattermole was working on his crossword puzzle, and Mrs. Denby was knitting thickly and looking slightly irritated, most likely because she had dropped a stitch several rows before. Miss Marple greeted them politely and approached the bar. Young Sarah, the innkeeper's daughter, was cleaning off glasses and singing under her breath. She brightened when she saw the elderly woman. "Morning, Miss Marple. It's a little damp again." "It is true, sweetheart. Do you believe drizzle suits villages better than sunshine? Gives folks an excuse to stay inside and consider things out." Sarah smiled, unsure if this was casual conversation or the start of anything more serious. Miss Marple inquired gently, "Has Agnes Whittle been in recently?" Sarah's hands paused on the cloth. "Yesterday evening I sat alone. I didn't drink much, just some sherry. He seemed unhappy." "Did she speak with anyone?" "Except for the bartender, who once asked if we'd had any letters go astray recently." "It seemed weird considering." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "And what did he say?" Sarah gave her a slight shrug and assured her no one had said anything. "We're hardly a post office." Miss Marple nodded as if this satisfied her curiosity, then turned to depart. But it did confirm something for her. Agnes was observing more than just her shop window. She was waiting for consequences. That meant Thomas's letter, whether delivered or not, had something to do with her. As Miss Marple stepped back out into the rainy morning, her mind turned back to the button. The thread that clung to it was the same as the yarn used in Agnes's pale cream cardigan, which she had worn every Sunday and had not been seen in since the morning of the murder. A cardigan that, when closed up to the neck, concealed the fact that one button was missing. Miss Marple arrived at the dry goods shop around 11 a.m. Agnes Whittle stood behind the bar, sleeves rolled up, rearranging syrup tins with a force that suggested stress or a bad night's sleep. Her hair, which was always neatly plaited and fastened, was fraying slightly at the head. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said without looking up. "Good morning, Agnes. You seem really pale." Agnes uttered a sound halfway between a laugh and a scoff. "So it has not been an easy week, has it?" "No, it has not." Miss Marple chose a jar of pickled onions from the shelf. "What a strange business. I always believed Thomas was unremarkable, steady, punctual, a creature of habit. But it appears he had secrets." Agnes looked up sharply. "Secrets?" Miss Marple replied softly. "We all have letters that we wish we had not sent, received or read aloud." Agnes's expression flickered. "Not dread, not quite. It's more like the blink of a curtain drawn an inch too late." "I didn't know him well," Agnes admitted stiffly. "Not personally." "Of course not," Miss Marple answered. "Only I recall a bad experience a few years ago. Something to do with a misunderstanding regarding a parcel sent to the incorrect address. It was a matter with your sister, right?" Agnes laid down the pan with a bit too much care. "That was a private matter." "Yes," answered Miss Marple politely. "But isn't that the problem with letters? They frequently begin privately and end otherwise." For a long time Agnes said nothing. She then turned away, walking to the back room with rigid shoulders and shaky hands. Miss Marple departed softly. She returned home, where the fire in the great room had died down, and sat in the silence that signaled that the puzzle was coming together. Someone had written a letter and hoped it would be delivered silently. But Thomas, whether on purpose or by mistake, had either failed to deliver it or, worse, opened it. Miss Marple could only think of a few reasons why a postman would break that rule, and they all revolved on fear. Either he suspected the contents or recognized the handwriting. She had a visit in the middle of the afternoon. Inspector Mallory, as tall and precise as ever, stood at her door, winded and irritated. "I understand you've been asking inquiries," he explained politely. Miss Marple grinned. "I find that asking questions keeps the mind supple. Supple or not, I'd love it if you could share anything helpful with me personally." She beckoned for him to sit and served him a cup of tea. When he was calm, she presented the ripped letterpiece and the button. She set them on the table as offerings. Mallory observed them both. "Where did you obtain this?" "I found the note near the church path. The button is near the reeds. It complements a cardigan worn by Agnes Whittle, who has been very reluctant about wearing it subsequently." Mallory's brows came together. "Why didn't you bring it sooner?" she responded gently, recognizing that observation comes before action. One must grasp the context. Without that, a button is just a button. Mallory looked down at the items again, then back at her. And what's your theory? She drew him there. I guess she was afraid of something in the mail. Perhaps a letter revealing something from her past, or possibly something more current. I believe she panicked. Mallory muttered, She's not a violent woman. No, Miss Marple replied, but desperation can drive even lovely people to do awful things. Mallory moaned and rose. I'll chat with her, but make no assumptions, Miss Marple. No, she agreed. Only pray that we aren't too late. She watched him leave, then turned back to her window. The village was silent again. But something behind the silence was changing. A once-buried truth was rising like silt from the bottom of a pond, and Miss Marple, ever patient, was waiting to see what more might float to the surface. By early evening, the rain had subsided, leaving Nether Durnham's streets with a glossy sheen. Water clung to the edges of window glass, and smoke ascended slowly from chimneys as families settled down for the calm rituals of dinner. The serenity had broken inside the Whittle residence above the dry goods shop, however. Agnes Whittle sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at a teacup that she had not touched. Inspector Mallory's questions began kindly, even compassionately, but as he set out the events, his tone became sharper. Agnes first responded with stiff calm to her lost button, silence regarding the letter, and presence along the chapel walk on the night of Thomas Larkin's death. Her voice had cracked when he mentioned the torn letter. Her hands trembled, and for a little period it appeared that she could talk freely. Then she changed. Her lips tightened into a line, and her eyes hardened again, brittle with denial. I've told you, she said. I wasn't anywhere near that pond. Mallory sighed and departed with a warning. If anything came to surface that contradicted her account, she may face formal charges of obstruction. Now she sat alone in the echo of that visit, her heart beating against her ribs. The shop below was closed, but a faint creak on the stairs startled her. She turned hastily, the wind banging the back door frame. Still standing, she checked the lock and drew the curtain. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk across the hamlet, her stress palpable. The pin, the note, Agnes's sudden iron determination. These pieces all fit together, but the picture they created refused to come into focus. There was more beneath the surface, something older and more personal. Miss Marple lit a lamp and went to the small bundle of letters she had accumulated over the years, chiefly holiday greetings and invites to community events. But among them were 2 letters, both dated 6 years ago and addressed to Thomas Larkin. They were part of a suit filed by the Denby family regarding a misdelivered mail containing a confidential banking matter. Thomas had apologized in person, but he argued gently but strongly that the mistake was not his. The interesting thing was that Agnes Whittle was also mentioned in passing during the complaint. Miss Marple remembered now. There were immediately rejected reports that Agnes had been seen rummaging through the post sack in the sorting room one morning. Nobody had taken it seriously back then, but now she was holding one of the letters up to the light. The handwriting, rounded, precise, was not unlike the scroll on the torn note retrieved beside the pond. Although not identical, they have a similar posture. Then there was the phrase, "Never meant for you to see this," a line that could only be written by someone whose guilt predates the letter. Miss Marple stopped by the greengrocer's the next morning, bought a single apple, and asked little Daniel Rower to run another message. This one was addressed to Eleanor Broom in the library. The reply arrived quickly. Nina agreed to meet Miss Marple at St. Ethelburga's that afternoon, not in the library, but in the back garden where the herbs grew. Miss Marple came at precisely 2 o'clock, her gait slow but steady, her cane tapping once on the stone path as she approached the little garden. Nina was already there, arms clasped across her chest, her face pallid despite the warm weather. "You said it was about Geoffrey," she continued, her voice soft. "Has something happened?" "No," Miss Marple replied kindly, "but I feel something nearly did that night by the chapel as he waited for you." Nina turned away. "I've told you. I never meant to meet him there." "I know," Miss Marple explained, "because you never wrote that letter. It was submitted in your name, but the hand was not your own. It was a trap, not for him, but for Thomas." There was quiet. Eleanor gazed at her, shocked. But why should anyone? Because Thomas might have known something. Agnes had tried hard to keep it buried, Perhaps he received a letter inadvertently or otherwise that revealed a past transgression. Or maybe he just saw what he wasn't supposed to. Elena's lips quivered. I do not believe she is capable of murder. Miss Marple nodded. Neither do I. However, desperation is a unique thing. Elena murmured. She's not a violent woman. She might have frightened if she thought Thomas was about to speak or had already said anything, but she retains grudges. Yes, replied Miss Marple, and she enjoys controlling what people know. That's the most harmful type of concealment. That nightfall, the mood in the village shifted again. News spread that Constable Sims had retrieved a sheet torn from the local church ledger, stashed at the back of the vestry bookshelf. It was carefully folded, as if hidden in haste, and contained only a brief note in pale pencil. It was not an accident. She shoved him. There was no name or signature, but it was dated the same night the murder occurred. Mallory had it submitted for analysis, but he doubted the handwriting would be detectable. Still, it was enough to put more strain on Agnes, who hadn't been in her shop since the previous afternoon. By the time the sun had set and the hamlet windows had turned golden with lamplight, Miss Marple was back at her front window, watching the chapel way. She had urged Geoffrey Banbury to do something bold but not too risky. She observed the boy appear just after 8 p.m. He walked carefully down the path behind the chapel, just as he did that night. Instead of waiting in bewilderment, he knelt and knotted his shoelace near the patch of reeds, where the flattened grass still bears the ghost of an old footprint. The shadow moved. Someone walked out from behind the low chapel wall, not youthful, not swift, but deliberate. Agnes Whittle! She said something softly and sharply. Geoffrey stood slowly and backed away. Miss Marple couldn't hear the words, but she noticed Agnes reach forward, not aggressively but almost pleadingly. Geoffrey pulled back. Then he pointed not at her but to the end of the trail. Miss Marple stood in the clearing with her cane firmly placed by her boot. Agnes froze. There was a prolonged hush. Then she collapsed against the low stone wall, covering her face with both hands. I didn't intend to, she murmured just above a whisper. I merely wanted to scare him, to keep him from telling. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle yet confident. What was it, Agnes? What did Thomas learn? Agnes did not look up. It happened years ago. Only once. I read a letter. I should not have. I copied stuff down and blackmailed someone. It was dumb and harsh. I was young, but last week a letter arrived from the same person. He must have written to Thomas by mistake, or perhaps on purpose, threatening to reveal everything. I saw the mail as it passed through my business and recognized the handwriting. She breathed sharply. I drafted another letter and pretended to be someone else. I asked Thomas to meet me there. I merely wanted to speak with him, but he spotted me and knew. And when he tried to go, I got in the way. I did not intend for him to fall, but he stumbled back. He stumbled in the dirt and hit the button. She muttered. I caught his sleeve to stop him. It tore. I ran. I wasn't sure what else to do. Miss Marple remained motionless, staring at her with sorrowful eyes. Even secrets, she explained, can die more peacefully than this. The bells of St. Ethelbert's chimed the hour behind them, and the hamlet, which had been listening, finally heard the truth. The confession did not echo over the village like a bell toll. It did not erupt from rooftops or reverberate through the hedge with the force of gossip. Instead, it flowed from one quiet voice to another, moving gently and almost politely across Netherdom's quiet channels. Agnes Whittle was not arrested that night. Inspector Mallory, summoned to the site by Miss Marple's note and already waiting on his desk when he returned from the constabulary, arrived just as the chapel bell finished chiming. Agnes did not resist, protest, or grieve. She stood as if she had aged 20 years in 20 minutes and walked with him to the train. Escorted not by force but by need, she was charged with involuntary manslaughter, which means she did not have malice or intent to kill, but rather irresponsible conduct, concealing the truth and deliberately manipulating trust. Agnes admitted to writing the letter, enticing Thomas there and confronting him in the goal of silencing a previous indiscretion. But she didn't expect him to collapse. She had not anticipated the muck to give way or the water to carry him so quickly. I thought I could scare him, she said Mallory in the interview room, her voice husky. He was always listening. I believed he would understand. Miss Marple, meantime, went home to a low violet sky, the clouds thin and stretched as if the heavens had exhaled. The village was quiet but not still. Lamps flickered behind lace curtains, and little shadows walked down the narrow passageways, neighbors chatting about what they now understood or believed they knew. The truth was rarely so clear. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a small pot of tea cooling beside her, and her thoughts turned to Thomas rather than Agnes. She recalled how he had always stopped to nod at her gate, how he had once carefully rescued a kitten from the bakery's roof, and how he always kept peppermints in his pocket for children who waited eagerly on their doorsteps. He did not deserve such a fate, and she suspected in her quiet way that Thomas knew far more than he ever said. That is why the next morning she requested to inspect the contents of the post sack. Inspector Mallory was skeptical. The sack had been delivered unopened to the regional office, with its contents catalogued and scanned. "There is nothing missing or weird," Miss Marple urged. She said that a letter did not belong, one inserted but not uploaded, a trap camouflaged as a routine. Mallory reluctantly consented. He arranged for the bag to be returned for its contents to be reviewed again, not by machines or clerks, but by me, carefully and deliberately. And there it was, a plain envelope with no return address, stamp or postal mark, just put amid the rest as if it had always belonged. The letter inside was typewritten, cold, exact, and not signed. It said, "You believed no one would ever know, but I know you hid your guilt behind church songs and tea cakes, but I saw what you did. I retained a copy. If I share what I know, your name will be meaningless. You will lose everything until you put things right. There has only been one meeting and chat behind the chapel so yet." Miss Marple read it just once. Then she folded it, laid it carefully on the table, and glanced at Mallory. Agnes thought this was meant for Thomas, but it was actually designed to scare her. Mallory frowned. "You're saying she didn't protect herself? She was being blackmailed?" Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. She was convinced she was. That is why she panicked. But that letter wasn't written by the person she feared. Someone wrote that with the intention of making her panic. Mallory looked at her, and then at the letter. "But who? Why? I'm not sure yet," Miss Marple admitted quietly. "But it was not Agnes who pushed Thomas." "I no longer believe that." Mallory blinked. But she confessed to confronting him, clutching his sleeve and panicking. "But look at this letter, Inspector. Does that seem like something she would write herself? Would she incriminate herself thus much?" Mallory opened his mouth and then closed it. He massaged his temples. "I'll have it checked for fingerprints," he said finally. "Do," Miss Marple instructed. "And while you're waiting, chat with Elena Broom again." Elena. She was the only one who was aware that Geoffrey was waiting behind the chapel that night. However, that same location was picked for Thomas's meeting. Eleanor did not tell anyone, except perhaps one person. And that individual used their understanding to lure Thomas in. Mallory just stared. "Do you think she is involved?" Miss Marple answered. "I think someone used her. Or perhaps she let herself be used. In any case, the chapel was carefully selected." Later that afternoon, Mallory returned with confirmation. The letter included one partial fingerprint, not Agnes's, Elelana's, or Thomas's. "It belongs to Jeff Banbury." Miss Marple did not say anything at first. Then she nodded slightly and closed her eyes for a long time. When she opened them, her tone was almost gentle. He was terrified. That is why he lied. That is why he admitted to being present when he had not intended to be. I questioned why he said he heard a splash. Nobody else did. Mallory frowned. "Do you think he fabricated the letter?" "I believe he intended it as a joke, a test or a form of petty payback. Young guys with amorous ambitions are not necessarily sound thinkers." Helena rebuffed him, maybe harshly, perhaps when he saw her talking to Thomas. "You believe he meant to scare Helena?" "I believe he utilized the chapel walk to draw her out, but Thomas went instead. When he saw Thomas, I suppose he panicked." The inspector stroked his chin. "Do you think he pushed him?" I believe Thomas fell, as Agnes claimed, but Geoffrey was there. He saw it and ran." Mallory rose abruptly. "We'll interrogate him again." But it was needless. That evening, Geoffrey Banbury arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on his own accord. He appeared pale, haggard, and much older than his 19 years. He murmured, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. That was a joke." "Just a joke. I expected Elena to find it courageous and romantic. She'd been quite cold. I wanted to prove that I was not invisible. He sat heavily in the chair beside Miss Marple, his face covered with both hands. I watched Thomas walk down the path. I didn't realize he had found the letter. I just hid behind a wall. I was going to say something to scare him off. But then Agnes came from the opposite direction. They argued. He attempted to depart. She stepped in front of him. He slipped. I heard the splash and then she bolted. Miss Marple sat silently. I should have helped, Geoffrey whispered. I should have shouted, but I froze. She stretched forward and took his tiny, frigid hand. We do foolish things when we're young, she remarked quietly, but we must learn from them, or we carry them forever. Geoffrey turned himself up that night, accompanied by his father and Miss Marple. He was not charged with murder or manslaughter, but his letter, that one nasty fiction, set everything in motion. Agnes acted with dread. Thomas had died by mistake, and Nether Durnham, now quiet, had discovered that even the smallest deception may have long-reaching consequences, disrupting far more than planned. In the days that followed, life resumed. The bakery has reopened. The post was delivered again. The chapel bell rung as scheduled. In her garden, Miss Marple planted snowdrops near the fence. They bloom, she told the vicar one morning. Just when you'd almost forgotten to expect beauty, the vicar nodded thoughtfully but said nothing. By the time Geoffrey's confession was recorded, the atmosphere in Nether Durnham had changed once more. Not precisely cleared, but settling into a new uneasy silence. His revelation was followed by a kind of silence. The hamlet was astonished not by the crime itself, which turned out to be more of an accident than murder, but by the understanding that it had all started with something so terribly simple. A gesture, a joke, a pained emotion in the heart of a youngster who is too clever for his own benefit. Miss Marple had seen this before. Not frequently, but enough to realize that youthful irresponsibility was just as hazardous as malice. It carried no calculation, no cold blood, just the heat of impulse, the urgent want to be noticed. That evening she sat in her sitting room, shawl tucked high on her shoulders, knitting steadily like if she were rocking a restless infant to sleep. The clack of her needles resonated quietly, almost companionably around the home. Outside, the street lamps lit up one by one as if reclaiming the night. All of this began with a letter, or at least the illusion of one. A boy attempted to generate friction between two persons. He had forged a message, drawn it up in secret, and hidden it not only in the postbox but in the natural flow of the hamlet, perhaps arrogantly believing that he understood the game well enough to play it. But humans, Miss Marple mused, aren't just pieces on a board. They bring with them ancient wounds, suppressed fears and ugly facts that do not fit neatly into boxes. Agnes had frightened because the letter, despite being forged, rang true in a place she had spent years attempting to forget. And Thomas, ever mild, had gone to meet the ghost of another's secret. Inspector Mallory arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the next morning with calm resolution rather than haste. He carried no notes and wore no scowl. Instead, he delivered a simple brown paper parcel tied with thread. He handed it to her without saying anything, then walked inside as she motioned toward the hearth. Thomas Larkin's personal effects, he murmured, settling into the armchair she provided. Returned from the sorting office yesterday. I thought you would like to see them before they are boxed away for good. There appears to be no family to claim them. Miss Marple accepted the package with a polite nod. She slowly removed the string, taking care not to break the paper as if she were holding something sacred. Inside, a worn leather wallet, a small ring of keys, a handkerchief embroidered with a nearly faded initial, and a single slim book with creased corners and a dog-eared spine. She opened the cover and made some observations about human kindness. It was an old print with mid-century faded gold lettering. The first page contained a penciled note in Thomas's handwriting. Page 42, what Agnes never understood. Her fingers lingered over the words. Mallory leaned in gently. She turned the page. The scripture stated, "It is not sin itself that destroys the soul, but the quiet that follows it. To speak even in shame is to start afresh." They sat silently for a moment. He knew, Miss Marple replied calmly. He must have remembered what she'd done years before. Or perhaps she told him once and assumed he forgot. Mallory nodded. Do you feel he was attempting to help her? I do. He was the type who didn't hold grudges. He carried wisdom calmly and tenderly, And when he believed someone could suffer too long in silence, I believe he wanted to let her speak, or offer her the opportunity to do so. Mallory leaned back. His expression is attentive. Instead, she feared being exposed. Yes, Miss Marple replied, because fear lives longer than truth, Inspector, especially when left alone for too long. He was quiet for a while. Then he rose, touched the edge of his hat with respect, and left her to her thoughts. Later that day, word spread that Geoffrey Banbury had been taken to his uncle's estate in Dorset. There were no formal charges pursued, but the official caution remained on his record for several years. His father, stiff-lipped and wounded, had apologized to the town on his behalf and requested understanding. It was not well welcomed, but neither was it met with indignation. Agnes Whittle, who was still under formal supervision, consented to close her shop and leave the upstairs flat. Her solicitor, summoned from Eastbourne, arranged for a distant cousin to handle her affairs. She would not return. Her farewell remark spoken through tears and without denial, asking only that the people remember her for something other than the fall. Helena Broom, maybe the only character whose name never made it to the center of the maelstrom, calmly returned to her library post. She kept her head down, her eyes dropped and her hair slightly looser around the top. Miss Marple thought she had not yet forgiven herself, not for what she had done, but for what she had overlooked. The village gradually regained its shape. The chapel grounds was free of police tape. The pond behind it remained still and unvisited, and when Thomas's bicycle was eventually removed from the war memorial, it was not scrapped or discarded. Miss Marple's gentle idea was accepted by the village council, who had it painted, mended and hung near the chapel gate, alongside a modest plaque in memory of Thomas Larkin, who conveyed kindness as well as letters. Miss Marple observed the plaque unveiling from a bench near the vestry path. She did not speak during the ceremony, did not give a speech, and did not accept credit. But those who knew her noticed how her gaze lingered on the vacant walk behind the chapel, and they understood. The days that followed were nondescript, purposefully so. Rain returned. Laundry lines fluttered. The grocer's chalkboard once again advertised apples in crates, while the vicar started his weekly lectures on moral modesty, albeit in a more hushed tone than normal. On Thursday, Miss Marple returned Elena's borrowed book with a nice remark and a freshly made lemon biscuit wrapped in wax paper. Elena did not respond, but she accepted it with both hands, and something in her posture changed. On Friday, Daniel Rower, a young child, delivered a thank-you card in fine type. It was addressed to Miss M and had only one sentence. "I am pleased you were watching." She silently pinned it to the inside of her pantry door. That weekend, she entertained her niece and two great-nieces for tea. The home resounded with laughter and small spoons clinking against teacups. When one of the girls questioned her with a child's earnestness if she'd ever solved a true mystery, Miss Marple laughed and responded quietly, "Well, sometimes the hardest mystery is remembering how to forgive people and how to let them do the same." After they departed, she sat by the window again, watching the fading light create puddles across the lane. She remembered Geoffrey's shaking hands, Agnes's bowed back as she stepped into the station, and Thomas's meticulous handwriting tucked into the first page of a forgotten book. The postman who never left a letter had, in the end, accomplished considerably more than he realized. And as the sun set behind the chapel, Miss Marple whispered a line she'd read years ago and never forgot. A village never forgets its secrets, but it occasionally forgives them. And with that forgiveness, life continued on quietly and pleasantly. The days that followed were not without echoes, though the village of Nether Durnham had returned to its normal pace, with hedgerows trimmed, milk bottles clinking on stone steps, and Sunday sermons floating over the churchyard wall. A strange silence lingered. Not the hush of dread or humiliation, but the deliberate silence that occurs when people look too closely at themselves and are still choosing what to do with what they've seen. Miss Marple recognized that type of stillness. It was the transitional period between knowing and speaking, and it was frequently the most honest part of any confession. She returned to her garden. Spring's first crocuses had emerged from the moist soil, delicate and stubborn. As she bent to cut the brown leaves from the base of her camellias, she remembered Thomas Larkin, who had always complimented her flowers in passing, never invading or presuming, merely offering a quiet, "Looking nice, Miss M," as he passed by the gate. It was strange how many aspects of a person's life might be remembered in little steady moments rather than spectacular flashbacks. A voice, a glance, a habit of kindness. Thomas was full of such things. So when Ellen Broom knocked on the door that Tuesday afternoon, hat in hand and unusually red-rimmed eyes, Miss Marple knew right away that the girl had not come to collect overdue books. "May I sit?" Eleanor inquired once ushered inside. "Of course, dear." They sat opposite from each other, the tea tray between them untouched. "I've been thinking," Eleanor finally remarked, "about what would have occurred if I had spoken up sooner." "You told the truth," Miss Marple stated kindly. "Eventually." "Yes, but not until someone dies. Not before others were hurt." Miss Marple didn't argue. Instead, she poured the tea, offered Eleanor a cup and gently stated, "Most people speak only when they believe they will still be liked afterward. It's braver, I think, to speak when they fear they won't." Eleanor did not say anything for a time. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This arrived in the Intel Post last week. It was a mistake. Came from a smaller branch near Woking. It's addressed to Thomas and dated the day before his death." Miss Marple took the envelope. The calligraphy was neat, loopy, and unhurried. Most likely it is a woman's hand. There was no return address, only a blurry but clear postmark. She unfolded the letter and began reading. "Dear Thomas, I know you'll be startled to hear from me after all this time, but there are some things I never mentioned that I now feel I need to correct before it's too late. I once offended a girl from your village, and I fear that my silence enabled someone else to do worse in my name. I now know that Agnes Whittle copied my letter. She utilized my tale to achieve her own goals. I never wanted to cause harm, just to go. I have enclosed the original letter. Do what you believe is correct. You always did. There was no enclosure, simply a shadow of one. The top of the page exhibited evidence of ripping. The second sheet had been removed." Miss Marple exhaled softly and put the letter down. "I assume," she continued, "that Thomas did receive this and wanted to face Agnes, not to embarrass her but to give her an opportunity to come clean herself. He probably kept this letter with him, or left it somewhere safe." Eleanor looked down, but it was not on him. "No," Miss Marple muttered, "because someone else took or discovered it later and was concerned about what it contained." She stood and went to the sideboard, where her recipe book, with the inspector's initial letter still tucked inside, lay beneath a new stack of mail. She withdrew the ripped sheet she had found by the pond days before, the one with the smudged handwriting and the statement, "Never meant for you to see this." She set it beside the fresh letter. Same paper stock, same faded typewriter ink. Eleanor leaned in. However, if the original letter was enclosed with this and Thomas carried it, Miss Marple concluded that someone else removed it after his death or shortly before. Perhaps they duplicated some of it, rewrote it and awarded it as a threat. "Geoffrey," Eleanor murmured. "He must have found it and then written his own version to make it look like someone else was blackmailing Agnes." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied gently. "He most likely never comprehended the complete context, save that it included Agnes' wickedness and something hidden. He recognized an opportunity to set people in motion." Eleanor's face reddened in humiliation. "I introduced them as Geoffrey and Agnes. I told her he was clever and bright. I figured he could help with the shop's accountancy. I assumed he was harmless. No one is ever completely innocent, Eleanor." Miss Marple responded gently. "Only occasionally lost." The next day, Miss Marple proceeded to the station with the letter in her hand. Inspector Malalary accepted it without comment, reading it twice and inhaling deeply. "More ghosts," he mumbled. "Just when I thought we'd laid them all to rest." "They never rest," Miss Marple explained. "They only wait for the living to do so." Mallory closed the file carefully. "Well, this doesn't change the charge. Agnes persisted in luring him there. Geoffrey still departed the scene." "No," Miss Marple concurred. "However, it is possible that this alters our memories of them." Miss Marple returned home that afternoon to find a small parcel on her doorstep. There was no message or name, but the wrapping was immaculate and the tape was cleanly folded, indicating that it had been done with care. Inside, there is a small brown notebook with worn corners. She opened it cautiously. It was Thomas's. Each page contained a quote, a sentence from a sermon, a remark from a neighbor, and a snippet of overheard poetry. No dates or explanations, just sentences gathered over years of patient listening. One on the last page was written in darker ink than the rest. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do with a secret is to keep it safe until the person who needs to talk is ready. Miss Marple closed the book, placed it on the shelf next to her tea tin, and stood at the window as the light faded over the hamlet. In the distance, a new postman walked up the path, his bag lightly bouncing against his side. The gate creaked, the bakery bell chimed quietly, and somewhere in the soft folds of dusk, Nether Durnham turned another silent page. Miss Marple awakened the morning after the journal arrived, before the sun had fully risen over Nether Durnham's rooftops. The village remained in shade, dew lying on hedges and roof tiles like a hush over murmured words. She lay in bed for a little longer than normal, listening to the world's quiet breath through the open window, the rustle of a bird in the ivy, and the creak of wood expanding in the warmth. There was still something undone, possibly not in the eyes of the law, but in her own quiet sense of reality. She got up, dressed, and placed the brown notebook into her purse. The phrase Thomas had written on the last page rang in her mind like a quiet bell. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do with a secret is to keep it safe until the person who needs to talk is ready. She had always known Thomas knew people far more than most people gave him credit for. He had studied the town not as an observer, but as a keeper of its subtle rhythms, unsaid regrets, and minor reconciliations. But one secret remained unresolved. Why had Thomas waited? Why hadn't he brought the letter forward sooner, knowing what Agnes had done and how it had affected others? Why keep such a burden for so long? Miss Marple knew exactly where to look for an answer to that query. She arrived at the church right as Reverend McInnes was unlocking the front entrance. He gave her a friendly smile, the type that priests save for individuals who ask few questions but know far too much. "Miss Marple," he remarked, moving aside to let her in, "I presume that you're not here for an early confession." "No, Reverend," she answered gently. "Just a few simple truths." He tilted his head. "Do you think the church still has some left?" She gave him a slight smile. "I suppose Thomas left one here, and you helped him retain it." They sat in the front pew, two single figures amidst the immense silence of old stone and filtered light. Dust wafted through the slanted beams over the altar. The air smelled like grease and old wood. Miss Marple took the notepad and placed it in the vicar's hands. "He quoted from your sermon here," she explained. Multiple times, however, the one on the last page appeared to be from a conversation rather than a pulpit. Reverend McInnes moved to the last page and read it quietly. His shoulders raised, then slowly descended. He finally said, "Yes, that was my." He asked me about forgiveness, not for himself but for someone else. I did not press him. I could tell he wasn't ready to name his grief, so I offered what I could. He closed the notepad and handed it back to her with care. He went on, "I believe he waited out of mercy, not cowardice. He didn't want Agnes exposed. He hoped she'd make the decision on her own. I believe he was attempting to assist her in carrying the weight for a short period of time, so that she could eventually let go." Miss Marple nodded, and for a time they sat in reverent stillness, free of stress. "But something has changed," she said. "Yes," the Reverend replied. "Someone else interfered. Geoffrey's letter, that vicious parody, destroyed the peace Thomas had maintained. Agnes assumed the worst, and Thomas discovered the misunderstanding too late. The weight rested between them like an old garment." Miss Marple stood slowly but steadfastly. "Thanks, Reverend. That completes the last missing piece." She exited the church as the early light rose over the hamlet roofs, illuminating the bricks and windows with peaceful fire. The bakery door was propped open to chill new loaves that were steaming in the morning air. The smell of yeast and butter wafted down the street. The bicycle bell chimed. "Not Thomas's, but it will do." Miss Marple turned to face the green, where the newly painted bicycle stood beneath the plaque. She read the message again, softly caressing the handlebars in memory of Thomas Larkin, who carried kindness more than letters. She turned to see Inspector Mallory approaching from the corner. He had the appearance of someone who had come not to pass judgment, but to obtain understanding. "I've read the letter," he said, ignoring preliminaries. "The one you brought from Elela Nena, and the page from the notebook." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then you know he never wanted to expose anyone, just to give her a chance." "Yes, and we missed it. We all overlooked the reality that he had spent years attempting to protect others from harm, including many who did not deserve it." Miss Marple looked at him for a moment before saying, That's always the danger, Inspector. Goodness seldom yells. He gazed out across the green, hands buried in his coat pockets. We will not reopen this case. The charges remain as they are. Geoffrey's record is marked. Agnes has chosen exile, but I will update the official report. The conclusion will include the truth, or as much of it as the law permits. That will suffice, Miss Marple said. He looked at her. You always saw the threads before the rest of us. How? She smiled slightly. People leave behind patterns, Inspector. They don't realize they're doing it, but they are through their silences, kindnesses, and avoidance of specific names or repetition of phrases. And once you see the pattern, the rest follows. Mallory nodded. Well, I hope the next mystery is a little easier. Oh, Miss Marple replied softly. I'd rather hope not. He chuckled and tilted his cap. Good day, Miss Marple. Good day, Inspector. She turned to look at the bicycle one last time as he went away toward the station. That evening, as the sun set behind the fields and the lane sparkled with the light warmth of late spring, Miss Marple returned to her desk and penned a brief note to the woman whose name had never been revealed. Dear M, your letter arrived in the correct hands, albeit too late for the man who delivered it. Thomas kept more than just secrets. He protected the space for them to make things right. I hope you have found peace. I hope Agnes follows suit someday. The village remembers. But gently now, and I think that's enough. Yours, Jem. She folded it, sealed it in a plain envelope and slid it into the drawer beside the window. She didn't have an address to mail it to, but some letters were meant to be written and understood, rather than sent far. Outside, a young child on a scooter stopped by the fence and waved. Miss Marple waved back. Then she sat, picked up her needles and returned to the shore she had left behind over the long weeks of investigation. The wool felt warm in her hands, the rhythm familiar, and as the stitches slowly collected beneath her fingers, the world beyond her garden became calm and entire again. The post had arrived, the secrets had been revealed, and kindness had prevailed in the silence that followed. In the weeks that followed, the community of Nether Durnham did not forget, but rather silently folded the narrative away, like a well-worn letter returned to its envelope and tucked into a drawer. The shock had faded into reflection, and while voices remained subdued when discussing Thomas Larkin or Agnes Whittle, there was no longer any fear, only a quiet reverence. Miss Marple, who had walked each step of the mystery with silent clarity, found herself back in the vicarage garden one bright morning, where crocuses bloomed beneath the stone wall and bees stirred lazily above the rosemary. Reverend McInnes was cutting a climbing rose with more determination than competence, and as she approached, he smiled and lowered his shears. I suppose we've returned to the ordinary at last, he was saying. There's no such thing as ordinary in a village, Miss Marple responded, resting down on the stone bench. Only quieter chapters between the louder ones. He chuckled and then sobered. I'm still thinking about Agnes and Geoffrey. What would have occurred if any of us had merely asked the proper question earlier? Miss Marple nodded. We generally presume that others will talk when they are ready. But shame can be a long quiet, Reverend, and young people, particularly those like Geoffrey, rarely comprehend the magnitude of the spark it ignites. The Reverend looked out toward the churchyard, where the restored gate was freshly painted. Still, you noticed it before the rest of us. The overall form. I didn't know, she said gently, but I observed Thomas's abandoned postbag, the letter that hadn't been properly sorted, and the button with the cream thread. All simple things. However, if we are willing to believe the minor things, they always convey the truth. She arose carefully, brushing a few flowers off her skirt. I've always thought it was a mistake to regard evil as loud and dramatic. However, I have rarely encountered such a situation. More often, it is hesitancy, fear, a failure to act, or simply a thoughtless act by someone who has yet to learn the consequences of quiet. That afternoon a parcel came at Miss Marple's cottage. No letter, no sender, just plain brown paper tied with twine. Inside was a newly bound copy of On Human Kindness and Other Observations. A snapshot was tucked between the pages. In his earlier years, Thomas Larkin stood in front of the post office with his bicycle. He wasn't smiling in the obvious camera-ready way, but something in his eyes indicated friendliness, the kind that rarely needs to be announced. She set it on her shelf next to the original volume, then sat down at her table and began writing. She addressed her letter to Geoffrey Banbury, Dear Geoffrey, I am not writing to judge you. That isn't my place. But I believe you deserve more than quiet right now. I believe you deserve to fully grasp the consequences of your choices, not as a punishment, but as a means of moving past them. Thomas Larkin never used your name in anger. He had once put your name in his notebook under a sermon passage that said, "Those who stumble need not carry the stone forever. You will carry these memories, but you may do so wisely. Let it shape you. Let it soften you." That was the only justice Thomas ever sought for. Yours sincerely, J. Marple. She sealed it, addressed it to Dorset, and gave it over to the new postman with a nod. The following Sunday, the village assembled in St. Ethelbert for the Spring Choral Festival, a long-standing custom that had been unbroken by death or scandal. Miss Marple sat in the fourth seat, her knitting tucked into her bag, and listened as the concluding hymn ascended across the nave, filling the ancient stone with a sense of absolution. When the final note faded, she strolled out into the sunlit churchyard, where new green had replaced the winter's brown, and the breeze carried the aroma of rosemary and bread from the hamlet beyond. She lingered by the memorial bike, her gaze drawn to the inscription in memory of Thomas Larkin, who carried kindness as well as letters. There was nothing left to say. No dramatic monologue, no severe confrontation. The mystery had been solved, not just in terms of names and acts, but also in terms of understanding, and Miss Marple believed that understanding was the ultimate form of justice. She turned away from the gate and walked slowly home. Her shadow was extended behind her, and her steps were light. Spring had arrived, and with it came new letters, new afternoons, and the quiet certainty that in every village, no matter how peaceful, the truth would be revealed, even if it arrived by post years later, in the hands of a boy who never meant to be cruel or a woman who once chose silence. And as the clouds parted above Nether Durnham's rooftops, Miss Marple, diligent watcher of all things quietly human, put the story to rest.